Hi, this is Alex from PHP Academy and welcome to this CSS tutorial on rounded borders, or the border radius property in CSS. Now we're going to be creating our container, giving it some round borders, seeing how easy it is to do, and then look at some more advanced options and how we can sort of create shapes with borders and specify two different values for the border radius. If you've never touched on border radius before, if you've never looked at border radius, it's extremely easy, so don't be put off with how complex it can get, but really try and grasp the basic concept of border radius and actually how easy it is. So we're going to just be creating a container. We're going to be rounding out the corners. We're going to be looking at rounding out specific corners. Then we'll go on to some of the more advanced stuff, which I'm only going to touch on because it's very unlikely that it will ever be used. I can only think of a few, not even a few, one or couple of circumstances that you might ever use the more advanced, specification or values for border radius. Anyway, let's go on and create our container, see how we can create our rounded borders and go from there. So I'm just going to create a container. I'm just going to give it an ID of container as we've used throughout most of this series. It can of course be applied to any element that you are able to manipulate borders, so majority of block elements, well, all of block elements. So any block element, if you give it a display of block, you'll be able to set the border radius. Obviously you need a background, because if we're going to be creating, I'm just going to be putting some content inside of here. In the browser, obviously the background is automatically white. If we create a border radius, we're not going to be able to see that. So we're going to be setting a specific width and a height of this container, setting a background color, and then we can start playing around with the borders. So I'm going to select container. I'm going to give it a predefined width and height. So I'm going to say width is 300 pixel. And I'm going to say height is 180 pixels. And I'm going to give it a background of, let's say, #BBB. Okay. So that's going to give it a light sort of grey colour. We've got a nice size to work with. We can sort of test out different radius of each border. Let's go ahead and just give it some padding. That's one of the things I just like to do to keep all the contents within. Okay, so now we've got our box or our container. Let's go ahead and start looking at the border radius property. Now the border radius property is actually the shorthand property for rounding the borders, so it looks like that. Now at the time of recording this tutorial and from now on, we don't actually have any vendor prefixes on this border radius property. Before, we had to use things like Moz border radius and WebKit border radius. But we don't have to do that now, because all browsers support border radius. It's so widely supported that you don't need to use browser browser prefix, vendor prefixing anymore. So we're just going to be looking at border radius, and we're going to first of all be looking at the individual options that we have for specifying each of the corners separately. Again, it's fairly unlikely that you'd ever have to do just this top left hand corner, but then again, it's always good to start from the ground up. So the four properties that we're going to be looking at are border top left radius, border top right radius, border bottom left radius, and as you've probably already guessed, border bottom right radius. So quite a mouthful there. You don't really, you don't need to specify these out for each one, but we can go ahead and we can give something like 10 pixels to the top left, 10 pixels to the top right, 10 pixels to the bottom left, and 10 pixels to the bottom right. So what's this going to do? Well, it's going to do exactly what it says, and it will round our borders for us. It will give our borders the radius that we've chosen. So in this case, it's 10 pixels. Now, in this case here, we've used each individual property. We would only use this if we wanted to define a different property, or a different value, a different length or size, if you like, for each of the corners. So for example, I might have 10, 15, 10, 15. Even then, you probably wouldn't use each value, because you can specify a lot easier using just the border radius property, which is of course the shorthand property for this. So how do we define the shorthand property? Well, that's easy. Let's go ahead and get rid of all of this, and we just use border radius. So border radius 10 pixels is equivalent to what we've just done. Nothing's changed, and we've saved ourselves 3 extra lines of code, as well as that inner space, by defining the top left, top right, blah blah blah. So essentially what you'd normally do in a project, if you needed a rounded corner, you would say border radius 10 pixel, border radius 5 pixel, border radius whatever you wanted to. You're more than welcome to use EMs, it doesn't matter, border radius 1 EM. You know, you get more or less the same effect, depending on how you're laying out your page and which styling or which you know, sizing constraints you're tied to. You might maybe or maybe not, depending. Now there's one interesting point about using the sizing here is percentages. Now if you have an element that is going to dynamically expand, so for example a text area can expand, oh no, actually no, that's irrelevant. Border radius of a percentage is great, because if you're using something like you know, something that's going to dynamically expand, blah blah blah. Let's say I give it a border radius of 50%. Now we can see that's created us a circle, which is great. That's great for creating shapes. If I go ahead and give this a width of 180, refresh, that's generated a circle for us. So that's you know, a useful way to do things. And obviously if this container was for example expanded in width and height, it maintains its aspect ratio, so we keep that shape in there. So just by using border radius 50%, we've you know, even if the width and height expand, we don't have to go back and keep changing this value here. Now it doesn't have to be just for generating, you know, cool effects like any shapes. We could give it a border radius of, say, you know, 3%. So we've got this nice border radius now. If I was to go ahead and expand the width of this, you see that we keep the same look about this. It doesn't, nothing, you know, changes too much. It obviously changes, but you know, we don't get a horrible look about it. If we say define 10 pixels and then change the width of this, we get a slightly more change when it's expanded and shrunk. Anyway, blah blah blah. You know, cool trick for creating a circle. I tend to always use pixels just when I'm defining shapes for containers, things like that. Anyway, let's go ahead and look at, you know, some slightly more advanced border radius property values. Now what we can do is we can specify not only the overall radius of the corner, we can go ahead and we can specify 2 values, and let's have a look at what it does. It's probably better just to look at what it does. Again, like I said, I'm not going to go too much into it. Okay, so border top left radius. Now I'm going to choose 2 values. I'm going to say 10 pixels and then I'm going to say 20 pixels. So I've chosen 2 values for the top left radius, which might seem odd because usually we would just say, well, I want a radius of 10 pixels. But by choosing 10 pixels and 20 pixels, take a look what happens. You can see that what happens is we get a slight curve as we come up. Well, we get a bigger curve. The radius is a lot more here, and that's this value here that we've defined, this 20 pixels here. And then as we get round, the radius sort of gets a little bit less than we'd expect. So that's 10, well, less than this value at least, which is 10 pixels. So the more we increase this value here, the more that side sort of slants and there and curves there. So with 10 pixels, if we would say 15, you'll see that all that just sort of changes a bit more. It rounds it off just a bit more. So we can create some interesting odd, weird shaped borders with this. Now again, it's something that you wouldn't expect to use on a daily basis unless you were creating a really odd shaped container for some reason. You know, that's entirely up to you, but this is a more advanced way to do things, and I'd probably suggest you go look this up, and if it's relevant to you. If it's not relevant to you, you know, you probably don't need to learn it, but this is essentially the basic of that. You know, and fiddling around with the values, you could go into Chrome. You could inspect this element and you could, you know, start playing around with these values. So you can increase that and see how it works. You see how it sort of changes its shape. We could go ahead and we could specify border bottom right radius. We could say 10 pixels and 10 pixels. And we can go ahead and start playing around with these as well. So we could really just, oh, sorry, going the wrong way. We could really just start to play around with shapes and see how we can, change the shape of an element, fiddling around with things. So, there's uses for this, but in, clean cut web development, there might not be. Anyway, that is border radiuses in CSS. We've covered the longhand properties, we've covered the shorthand property, which is almost always what you would use, and we've covered these more advanced curvatures. Now, one other thing, just quickly, when we are using border radius, if we were going to say border radius 10 pixels, but we wanted to say just the bottom left to be different, so let's refresh here. So we wanted just the bottom left one to be slightly less for some reason, or in fact to be nothing, then what we can do is we can go ahead and override this. So we can say border bottom left radius 0, for example. So we could sort of override that after we've set all corners. That would be a lot more efficient than setting border bottom left, border bottom right, blah blah blah. So we're just cascading down and overwriting the values that we've previously set. Another thing is, if we wanted to say, well, if I did this, say, let's say 10 pixel and 50 pixels, what would you normally expect from this? Well, it's not the advanced value that we've just spoken about. What does happen though is we set the top left and the bottom right to this value here, and we set the top right and the bottom left to this value here. Okay, so we're essentially doing what we would normally do when we do something like padding 5 pixels and 10 pixels. This is north and south, this is east and west. So we're doing the same sort of thing really, but we're using the border radius, which is obviously for completely different use. So that's essentially border radius. We've covered quite a lot, not too much of the advanced stuff, but enough for you to go ahead and use this and start to make nice, pretty elements in CSS.